October 15, 1944, Montabaur, Germany, headquarters of the Führer Grenadier Brigade. The air inside the operations bunker was thick with cigarette smoke and the heavy weight of grudging respect mixed with profound operational contempt. Reports flowed consistently across the Western Front, detailing the slow but inexorable advance of the American Third Army, and the consensus forming among the German general staff was dangerously dualistic. On one hand, the sheer, crushing material power brought to bear by the Americans defied historical precedent. They possessed an unlimited reservoir of fuel, vehicles, and high-explosive shells. The American soldier was, in the tactical summary of Field Marshal Model, an overwhelming logistical problem. But the soldier himself? That was a different matter entirely. The veterans of the Wehrmacht, particularly those recently rotated from the blood-soaked, unforgiving hell of the Eastern Front, scoffed openly at the performance of the bulk of the American infantry they encountered in the autumn fighting. These fresh, often clean-shaven replacements, the so-called green troops, were viewed not as hardened fighters, but as industrial products, well-equipped, mass-produced, and lacking the spiritual depth and tactical cunning honed by years of desperate defensive war. The intelligence summaries provided ammunition for this arrogant dismissal. American units, German analysts noted, demonstrated predictable habits. They were road-bound, fearful of infiltrating the dense forests, and excessively reliant on supporting fire. A Wehrmacht patrol, even deep behind enemy lines, would use the terrain, move silently, and engage in brutal, close-quarters fighting when necessary. The American approach, however, was seen as lazy, a product of a culture unused to hardship. If they met resistance, they rarely attempted the difficult maneuver. Instead, they stopped, called for overwhelming artillery, and waited until the ground was pulverized before advancing again. This was not war, it was demolition. They were mocked as Sunday punchers, soldiers who could win a clean fight supported by maximum firepower, but who wilted under sustained, disorganized pressure, or when their supply lines were temporarily severed. The Eastern Front had taught the Wehrmacht that true combat efficiency resided in the ability to fight without food, without communication, and without hope of immediate relief. The American soldier, accustomed to 3 hot meals a day, abundant medical care, and prompt rotation, was perceived as having a psychological breaking point far lower than that of the German veteran. German combat assessments widely highlighted the failure of American units to effectively patrol and secure their flanks, leading to devastating vulnerability to localized counterattacks. Their patrol discipline, a fundamental skill hammered into every grenadier on the Eastern Front, was slack. Sentries talked too loudly. Fires were visible at night, and movements were telegraphed. For the seasoned German officer, these were not simply mistakes. They were indictments of fundamental military education. The young American soldier, they concluded, was more concerned with the comforts of the rear than the grim realities of the front line. This general disdain was particularly sharp concerning American leadership. While acknowledging the occasional competence of high-ranking generals like Patton, the Germans believed that lower-level American officers lacked the initiative and ruthless self-reliance of their Wehrmacht counterparts. German junior officers were expected to lead by personal example, taking risks and adapting instantly to catastrophic changes. American officers, they assessed, were procedure-driven, hesitant to deviate from textbook orders, and often lacked the years of pre-war training or the crucible experience that defined the German officer corps. They were managers, not warfighters. This strategic underestimation became the psychological linchpin for the entire plan of Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Great Ardennes offensive. Hitler himself championed the belief that the American army was a paper tiger, that while the British had tenacity and the Soviets had less manpower, the Americans possessed neither the moral fiber nor the combat depth necessary to withstand a concentrated rapid thrust aimed at disrupting their massive logistical structure. The plan was predicated on the immediate collapse of the green U.S. divisions holding the line, divisions filled with the replacements the Germans so thoroughly scorned. The assumption was that once the Americans were cut off, denied their overwhelming support structure, they would rapidly surrender, lacking the grim, desperate motivation that kept the German lines intact even as the Reich crumbled around them. It was a fatal misjudgment of American resilience, a mistake born of arrogance and a failure to recognize that even green soldiers, given a fixed objective and the necessary desperate circumstances, could rapidly transform into granite to furs. The upcoming winter fighting would test whether their material superiority or German elite experience would prevail, and the testing grounds, particularly around a small Belgian hub called Bastogne, would soon reveal the deadly flaws inherent in the German High Command's contemptuous assessment. December 10, 1944, deep in the Schnee-Eifel forest, Belgium. A profound quiet settled over the American lines, a silence so deep it felt almost engineered. This quiet, however, was not the sound of peace. It was the acoustic trap of the Ardennes. The American Supreme Command viewed this 80-mile stretch of dense, road-poor, pine-choked terrain, running from Monschau down to Echternach, as the safest, least threatened sector on the entire Western Front. It was a natural barrier, a region perpetually shrouded in mist, snow, and the impenetrable blackness of winter nights, a place where major offensive operations, particularly armored thrusts, were considered logistically impossible. For months, the Ardennes had functioned as a grand military convalescent home. Weary divisions, battered in the hedgerows of Normandy or the brutal fighting for the Aachen Gap, were sent here to rest, recuperate, and fill their ranks with replacement personnel. Crucially, it was also the designated training ground for the newest arrivals from the United States divisions, straight out of basic training, their units filled with young men who had yet to hear a shot fired in anger, much less witness the disciplined horror of a German counterattack. They were the green troops the German command openly derided, and they were, ironically, tasked with holding the crucial center of the Allied line. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself believed the Germans lacked the fuel, the armor, and the manpower for anything more than localized spoiling attacks. The bulk of the hardened U.S. veterans, Patton's Third Army, Hodge's First Army, were concentrated far to the north and south, pressing hard against the Siegfried Line, preparing for the final push across the Rhine. The Ardennes, held thinly by Lieutenant General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps, was essentially a tripwire, relying on the rugged environment and the presumed exhaustion of the Wehrmacht to guarantee security. The result of this strategic assessment was an almost criminal dilution of defensive strength. The American front in this sector was stretched taut, sometimes to the breaking point, where doctrine called for 1 man per 10 yards. Some U.S. platoons found themselves responsible for sectors stretching hundreds of yards, with limited artillery support and nearly non-existent local reserves. The 106th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Golden Lions, had arrived on the line just days earlier, replacing the highly experienced 2nd Infantry Division. Many of its men had never fired their weapons at an enemy silhouette, let alone learned the vital art of interlocking defensive fire in the frozen forest. Life on the Ardennes line devolved quickly into routine and boredom. The greatest challenges were the cold, the less search for dry socks, and the monotony of sparse patrol activity. Soldiers focused on jury-rigging stoves from oil drums and scrounging for better rations. Reconnaissance was minimal. Why bother when the enemy across the line seemed content merely to exist? German activity was observed, of course, minor troop movements, an increase in supply traffic, but American intelligence dismissed these indicators as standard winter resupply maneuvers, necessary to prevent the existing German units from freezing in place. There was no widespread sense of urgency. Radio traffic was nearly non-existent on the German side, interpreted as a sign of crippled communications when, in reality, it was the sound of highly disciplined secrecy imposed on 3 entire German armies preparing for history's largest offensive since 1941. The front was quiet, yes, but it was the silence of a cocked pistol. The American commanders, lulled by months of forward momentum and the belief that the Germans were a broken force staggering toward Berlin, had made a fundamental tactical error, confusing tactical difficulty for operational impossibility. They had concentrated elite forces where they expected the enemy to attack in the plains and along the rivers, leaving the difficult, roadless terrain defed by precisely the kind of untested troops the German Panzer divisions were designed to overwhelm. The High Command had chosen the Ardennes as the optimal place to make its troops comfortable, turning a natural fortress into an unprotected staging ground. This complacency was rooted not just in underestimation of the enemy, but in a profound confidence in victory itself, a confidence that led to a softening of vigilance. The GIs guarding the Schnee-Eifel lines expected Christmas leave, maybe a slight German probe, but certainly not the thunderous dawn of massed armor commanded by seasoned SS generals. They went to sleep in foxholes dug into the frozen earth, believing that the war's desperate final acts were being played out far to the north and south, blissfully unaware that they occupied the exact geographic pivot point chosen for Hitler's final devastating gamble. The price for this widespread operational relaxation, for treating the front line as a training maneuver and a rest cure, would be paid in the brutal currency of shock encirclement and nearly unbearable sacrifice when the quiet forest suddenly exploded into a crucible of ice and fire. This quiet vulnerability established during the cold weeks of December positioned the American line perfectly for the catastrophic breakthrough, forging a baptism of fire for the untested young men who would soon have to prove that mockery of the Green Division was the most fatal mistake the German Reich had ever made. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. Along the northern flank of the American 106th Infantry Division's sector in the Schnee-Eifel, the quiet of a frozen, snow-dusted forest was annihilated by the most intense and concentrated artillery barrage launched by the German army since the invasion of France. The bombardment was not surgical, it was pure, unadulterated shock trauma. Thousands of heavy shells slammed into American positions simultaneously across an 80-mile front, ripping apart telephone lines, burying foxholes, shattering the composure of the young men who had believed this sector of the Ardennes to be a resting and training camp. The men of the 106th, the so-called Golden Lions, and their neighboring units, the weary veterans of the 28th Division holding the center, were hurled from sleep into a blinding, deafening apocalypse. The air thickened with fog, smoke, and fine snow, concealing the vast movement unfolding just beyond the tree line. This was Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's desperate, monumental gamble to split the Allied armies, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was a Hail Mary pass executed with the full fury of nearly 250,000 German troops, over 1,000 tanks, and the last remaining strategic fuel reserves of the Reich. The German armored spearheads, spearheaded by the elite Panzer divisions under Joseph Seff Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the north and Hasso von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army farther south, were counting on three things: the element of surprise, the atrocious weather that grounded Allied air superiority, and the softness of the American divisions holding the line. They got all three. In the first hours of daylight, German infantry, bolstered by self-propelled guns and flamethrowers, bypassed strongpoints and flooded the gaps created by the preparatory shelling. The thin American lines dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance. Communication vanished. Supply depots were overrun before staff officers even grasped the scale of the attack. The disaster that engulfed the American center was total. The 106th Division, composed largely of replacements and newly arrived troops, found two of its regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, completely encircled deep in the Schnee-Eifel. Isolated, freezing, and running low on ammunition, these units fought a grueling two-day battle against overwhelming force, lacking any clear orders and cut off from the rest of the American army. Nearly 7,000 men were eventually forced to surrender, the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in the European theater. The mockery of the Green troops seemed terribly vindicated, at least in the tactical sense. But even amid the catastrophe, the German plan began to falter, snagging on pockets of fierce, unyielding resistance. The speed of the breakthrough was paramount. German columns had to reach the Meuse crossings rapidly to starve the Allied response of time. But Dietrich's 6th Army encountered unexpected steel in the north, along the Elsenborn Ridge. Here, veteran units and artillery massed, refusing to yield the high ground. The 99th and 2nd Divisions fought ferociously, turning the northern shoulder into a grinding meat grinder that shattered the timetable for Dietrich's powerful armored columns, forcing them onto congested secondary roads. Further south, Manteufel's forces achieved greater penetration, but were immediately tangled in the strategically vital but geographically confining Belgian town of St. Vith. This key road hub, initially defended by isolated combat engineers and remnants of the shattered divisions, was reinforced by the quick arrival of the 7th and 9th Armored Divisions. Though the Germans desperately needed St. Vith to clear their logistical path, the Americans turned the town into a temporary fortress. For 5 critical days, the Defers of St. Vith anchored the flank, holding back 4 German divisions and forcing the enemy armor into even tighter bottlenecks across the treacherous terrain. Every hour gained at St. Vith and Elsenborn was an hour bought in blood for the rest of the American army, time for General Dwight D. Eisenhower to confirm the unbelievable fact of the massive German offensive, and time for George S. Patton's Third Army far to the south to begin the most famous 90-degree turn and countermarch in military history. The German breakthrough was magnificent in its audacity and terrifying in its initial success. The deep 70-mile bulge carved into the Allied line terrified London and Washington and sent shockwaves rippling across the Western Front. Yet, the very success of the armored dash created the conditions for its eventual failure. As the German columns raced west, they converged upon the few existing hard surface roads, turning rapid movements into tortuous, slow-motion convoys easily targeted by the meager American air reconnaissance that occasionally pierced the cloud cover. All roads west were vital, but one crossroads above all others suddenly became the hinge upon which the entire German plan pivoted: Bastogne. This small, unremarkable town sat atop a spiderweb of 7 radiating roads, absolutely crucial for the resupply and rapid movement of Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army toward the Meuse. By December 18th, 2 days into the offensive, the chaos of the retreat began to focus on this hub. Isolated American units, retreating westward, found themselves funneling through Bastogne, strengthening its defenses purely by accident. The men streaming through the town were exhausted, often without commanders, and certainly without sleep. But the fight had scrubbed away the last vestiges of their greenness. They were tested, they were shocked, and they were ready to hold a defensive line that now, entirely unbeknownst to them, represented the last viable defense of the Allied advance into Germany. The crucible of ice and fire had done its work, turning mockery into the hard, cold core of desperate resolve. The true measure of the American resilience was about to be taken in the deep snows of the Ardennes, paid for by those who had already endured the shock of the breakthrough and now understood that retreat was no longer an option. This stunning blow was merely the prelude to the defiant stand that would rewrite the war's final chapters, demonstrating that Hitler's desperate gamble had succeeded only in forging an unbreakable will among his enemies. December 17, 1944, 3:00 m. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, the mood was one of shocked sobriety as the sheer scale of the German thrust began to coalesce into a recognizable, terrifying shape. Intelligence reports, initially dismissed as fragmented noise, now screamed of multiple panzer divisions tearing through the sparsely held American lines. General Eisenhower and his chief strategists understood immediately that the true objective of this colossal counteroffensive was not localized revenge, but the vital logistical choke point of Antwerp. To reach that port, however, Hitler needed to seize the central arteries that crisscrossed the Ardennes forest and the very heart of that transit system. The hinge upon which the fate of the entire northern campaign would turn was the ancient Belgian town of Bastogne. Bastogne was strategically nondescript, save for one essential geographical fact. It was the hub for 7 critical paved roads, radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Any mechanized force intending to move quickly west through the deep winter snows had to use these roads. If the Germans seized Bastogne, the entire Allied logistical network would be severed, and their advance to the Meuse would become a swift, brutal certainty. The town had to be held, and it had to be held immediately. The only forces available capable of moving with the necessary speed and possessing the fighting pedigree for such a desperate mission were the two elite airborne divisions, the 101st Screaming Eagles and the 82nd All-American. These divisions, weary but intact, were resting and refitting in the relative tranquility of France, near Rheims and Mormelin, recovering from the grueling combat of Operation Market Garden. Their respite was violently shattered by the immediate, non-negotiable command from SHAEF: load up, move north, and plug the hole. The orders that filtered down to the airborne command centers were cryptic, simply stating that the divisions were needed for a serious breakthrough. Within hours of the initial alert, a logistical miracle of sorts unfolded. Officers scrambled, commandeering every available truck, trailer, and jeep they could find. Equipment, much of it, heavy artillery, vital radios, and essential medical supplies had to be left behind, sacrificed for speed. The men were crammed into the open beds of these transport vehicles, beginning a harrowing, freezing journey of over 100 miles into the deepening cold and chaos. This forced march was not merely a movement of troops, it was a journey against the tide of defeat. As the columns of trucks carrying the airborne soldiers barreled north, they passed streams of terrified civilian refugees, exhausted supply convoys heading south, and most ominously, demoralized remnants of shattered American divisions who had been the first to absorb the German punch. The stories filtering back were grim stories of entire battalions overwhelmed, of tank columns appearing where only woods should have been, and of the utter confusion reigning at the front. Yet these paratroopers were trained to jump into chaos, and the sight of retreating forces only solidified their innate sense of urgency. The 82nd Airborne was swiftly redirected slightly north to shore up the collapsing lines around the critical town of St. Thety. Vith, leaving the 101st Airborne Division under the acting command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, with the destiny-defining task of reaching Bastogne. The race was now timed in hours, perhaps minutes, against the German armored spearheads, particularly the lead elements of the Panzer Lehr and the 2nd Panzer Divisions, which were already closing in on the roads leading into the town. Starting late on December 18th and continuing through the morning of the 19th, elements of the 101st began trickling into Bastogne. The town, they found, was not a prepared defense, but a desperate junction teeming with administrative units, stragglers, and scattered artillery crews. General McAuliffe, recognizing the immediate threat of encirclement, ignored the temptation to establish a linear defensive line, which would be easily broken by the concentrated German armor. Instead, he ordered a hasty cordon, a circular all-around perimeter defense, utilizing the high ground and the dense woods surrounding the town. The paratroopers, exhausted and shivering from the long ride in the open cold, immediately began digging in. They arrived without winter gear, without sufficient ammunition for a prolonged stand, and critically, without the bulk of their anti-tank weaponry. Yet they possessed an unshakable confidence honed by repeated success in seemingly impossible situations. Their objective was not retreat, not tactical maneuvering, but simple, brutal denial. They had to transform a sleepy Belgian crossroad, currently nothing more than an exposed piece of tactical geometry, into an impregnable fortress before the German tide could wash over them. It was a matter of sheer willpower racing against the clock of mechanized warfare. Had the 101st arrived even 12 hours later, the town would have been seized, and the critical roads leading west would have been clear for the German rush to the Meuse. The deployment represented a brilliant, desperate gamble by Eisenhower, recognizing that only the agility and inerrant ferocity of the airborne infantry could counter the speed of the panzer divisions. The American soldiers who had scoffed at the green replacements now watched these elite troops deploy with ruthless efficiency, establishing the perimeter in the face of converging enemy forces. As the sounds of distant combat grew louder and the first skirmishes began to break out on the eastern approaches, the men of the 101st understood they had not arrived to stage a holding action, but to begin a defining siege, transforming themselves from hurried reinforcements into the final bulwark of the Allied line. The fate of the entire offensive now rested upon the fragile, hastily prepared ring of frozen foxholes around a small Belgian town that had suddenly become the center of the world. December 20th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. For Field Marshal Walter Model, the capture of Bastogne was a strategic diversion he could ill afford. His primary mission, dictated by Hitler himself, was momentum. The armored fist of the 5th Panzer Army could not be allowed to chew up vital hours fighting infantry for a crossroads town when the Meuse River and the massive Allied fuel dumps lay waiting to the west. Speed was paramount. Operational necessity demanded the town be quarantined, not conquered immediately. The architects of the Ardennes offensive, particularly General Hasso von Montefiore, understood the value of bypassing strong points. The rapid deployment of the 101st Airborne had indeed hardened the defenses, but Monteufel's elite panzer divisions, brimming with self-assurance, were tasked not with assault, but with sealing the town off like a tumor to be dealt with later. This decision marked a critical shift from a German advance slowed by resistance to an Allied defense facing imminent operational collapse. As the scattered U.S. units continued their disorganized retreat toward the perceived safety of the Bastogne perimeter, they were met not with the consolidating protection of the 101st, but with the chilling realization that German armor was already flanking them. The spearheads of the 2nd Panzer Division, driving relentlessly north, and the seasoned veterans of the Panzer Lehr Division, cutting southwest, executed the maneuver with brutal efficiency. For the young paratroopers digging into the frozen earth, the early morning hours brought a sound far more terrifying than the clatter of incoming artillery, the heavy grinding roar of hundreds of tracked vehicles moving rapidly, not toward them, but past their flanks and rear. They were hearing the engines of their ebbing isolation. These elite panzer units, heavily armed and moving with frightening velocity, deliberately punched through the ragged seams between the hastily established American perimeter sectors. By midday on December 20th, the 2nd Panzer Division had secured Wiltz and penetrated the American rear near the crucial northern roads. Simultaneously, Panzer Lehr's reconnaissance units were sweeping down the southwest, ensuring the main Allied supply artery, the N4 highway connecting Bastogne to Neufchâteau and the Allied railheads, was severed completely. The closing of the supply corridor was the decisive moment. Within hours, the 101st Airborne and the shattered remnants of the combat commands attached to them found themselves completely cut off. The roads leading into Bastogne, which had been crammed with fleeing vehicles and supply trucks just 48 hours prior, now lay desolate, watched over by German machine gun nests and forward observer teams. The communications network, already fragile, collapsed under the pressure of the encirclement. Field telephone lines stretching back to the Corps headquarters had been physically cut by German tanks traversing the fields. Radio signals, dependent on relay points now captured or overrun, grew faint and erratic. The beleaguered headquarters in Bastogne, led by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, could only communicate sporadically, forcing them to rely on messengers braving the German-held territory, a desperate and often fatal undertaking. The implications of this isolation were immediate and catastrophic for the fighting forces. Ammunition reserves, necessary for sustaining a protracted defense against armor, were quickly calculated as sufficient for only a few days of heavy fighting. Rations, hastily stockpiled, were adequate, but morale could not survive on food alone. Most critically, the medical supply situation became dire. Wounded men began to flood the small, improvised aid stations within the town, and without the possibility of evacuation or resupply of vital plasma and surgical materials, the chances of survival plummeted dramatically. The German commanders, satisfied with their progress, settled into a siege posture. They did not launch a full-scale infantry assault immediately. They preferred to let the elements and the psychological pressure work for them. They began methodically raining high explosive and rocket fire into the perimeter, attempting to break the cohesion of the trapped American forces. This was the strategic brilliance and the immediate horror of the German plan. Bastogne was now nothing more than a small frozen island of resistance, surrounded by a surging tide of German steel aimed at the distant Meuse. The entire defense rested not on tactical superiority, but on the sheer grit of the American troops to withstand the cold, the hunger, and the constant psychological torment of knowing that their only way out was to fight through a perfectly established ring of tanks and infantry. The gamble taken by the German high command, To prioritize speed over immediate conquest had paid off. They had achieved operational surprise and sealed the trap around one of the most vital strategic points on the Western Front. The price for the Americans was total reliance on what they had carried in on their backs, and perhaps more precariously, on the hope that the impenetrable cloud cover which had shielded the German advance for days would finally break, allowing the life-giving, if temporary, miracle of air resupply. Until that moment, the 101st Airborne was completely alone, facing the unblinking, relentless focus of Germany's most powerful armored divisions, transforming the fragile defense of a crossroads into an existential test of will that would define the Allied response to Hitler's last great offensive. Bastogne was no longer a battle. It was a state of complete, icy siege, its very existence dependent on the tenacity forged in the freezing foxholes. December 22nd, 1944, deep inside the perimeter surrounding the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne, the temporary life-giving resupply drop had vanished into the icy memory of the paratroopers, replaced by the immediate, grinding reality of sustained siege. The siege was not simply the presence of German tanks outside the wire. It was the continuous, eroding presence of the weather inside the foxhole. Temperatures plunged consistently below zero, sometimes reaching 20 degrees below freezing, turning the very air into a weapon. The men of the 101st Airborne and the fragments of attached armored artillery found themselves battling two relentless enemies, the Wehrmacht and the cold that seeped into their bones. A cold no-wool uniform could entirely defeat. The ground itself was frozen solid, transforming the already exhausting labor of digging a proper defensive position into an agonizing, hours-long battle with pickaxes and shovels against earth as hard as granite. Those foxholes, once established, offered protection from shrapnel, but offered no reprieve from the frost. Feet were the first casualty, unable to remove their boots often and constantly exposed to the dampness inside the shallow pits. Thousands of American soldiers suffered from trench foot. The tissue died slowly, silently, turning skin purple or black, leading to agonizing pain and eventual amputation if they were lucky enough to reach a medic in time. For every man wounded by a German shell, another was slowly disabled by the unforgiving environment. The cold read the wounded immobile and intensified the suffering of every minor scratch, turning simple exposure into lethal shock. The promised miracle of air resupply was essential, yes, but it was sporadic and imperfect. When the cargo chutes drifted down through the brief clearings in the overcast sky, they did not carry infinite stores. They carried just enough, and even the supplies delivered were often compromised. Blood plasma, crucial for stabilizing casualties, frequently froze solid before it could be administered. Ammunition, the most immediately critical need, had to be rationed with painstaking discipline. Machine gunners were told to fire only in short bursts. Riflemen were ordered to ensure every round found its target. The sound of rapid, sustained automatic fire was not a sound of confidence. It was the sound of a commander risking the depletion of his remaining reserves. The psychological pressure stemmed directly from this scarcity. Every paratrooper knew that if the shelling intensified, they might run out of mortar rounds before the next clear day. They knew that if their platoon leader was hit, there was almost certainly no morphine left to ease his agony. This knowledge did not incite panic, but it created an internal, steel-cold determination. They were fighting not just to hold Bastogne, but fighting against the certainty of their own limited resources. Inside the makeshift medical clearing stations, often cold, damp farmhouses or cellars, the situation was catastrophic. Medics, working under the most primitive conditions imaginable, were forced to make impossible choices. With plasma frozen and disinfectant running low, gangrene became a constant looming threat. Surgeons operated by the light of gasoline lanterns, performing amputations not just due to shell trauma, but preemptively to save lives threatened by the ravages of the cold and lack of sanitation. The wounded lay side by side, sharing what little warmth the stove offered, their cries often muffled by the near-constant rumble of German artillery outside. The German psychological warfare was relentless, capitalizing on the surrounding misery. Loudspeakers occasionally broadcast propaganda urging the trapped Americans to surrender, promising warm food and medical attention that the American command could not provide. These messages, coupled with the terrifying sound of the German Nebelwerfer rocket artillery nicknamed Screaming Miniamies for their terrifying high-pitched approach, worked to chip away at the edges of sanity. The psychological resilience required to ignore the immediate evidence of their isolation and the constant threat of a massive armored breakthrough demanded a superhuman mental fortitude. The 101st was functioning as a single collective organism of defense, relying on communication wires that were constantly being severed by shelling and runners who navigated the ice and snow under enemy fire. Commanders like Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe walked the lines, not with grand promises, but with a simple, stoic determination that mirrored his famous reply to the German demand for surrender. They were fighting on sheer willpower, substituting tenacity for the overwhelming firepower they lacked. Bastogne, during those darkest days of the siege, was more than a battle of tactical positions. It was the complete distillation of human urine. It was the test of whether American soldiers, often mocked by the German command as soft and inexperienced, could withstand total isolation, environmental cruelty, and material deficit while holding firm against superior armored force. They were redefined in those icy foxholes, transforming from the green troops of earlier campaigns into hardened veterans, forged in the crucible of absolute misery. The suffering endured by those surrounded paratroopers, the frostbite, the hunger, the shared terror under bombardment was the price paid for the definition of the American soldier's reputation in Europe. They held the hinge not because they possessed everything needed to fight, but precisely because they possessed nothing but their courage, and they refused to allow the frigid, desolate landscape to claim the victory the enemy could not achieve with tanks and shells. Their legacy is etched not just in the history books, but in the enduring silence of the Ardennes forests, which once muffled the cries of pain, now standing as a monumental testament to their profound and costly stand. December 22, 1944 was the day the trap was meant to spring shut entirely for General der Panzer Troop Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz, commanding the XLVIR Panzer Corps. The situation around Bastogne was not a crisis, but a clean logistical problem nearing its inevitable solution. His premier armored unit, the famed Panzer Division, along with elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, had completed the encirclement. They were not facing experienced, hardened formations like the British Guards or Soviet shock armies. They were facing, as Leutwitz saw it, a haphazard collection of American engineers, artillerymen, tank destroyers, and the lightly equipped, albeit stubborn, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. The German armored commanders had witnessed the rapid disintegration of American defenses elsewhere in the Ardennes. They saw the confused withdrawals and the abandoning of precious supplies. From their perspective, the forces bottled up in Bastogne were simply trapped remnants whose prolonged resistance served no tactical purpose other than to needlessly increase their own casualty count. German combat doctrine, even under the strain of a losing war, still retained a proud, almost chivalric element of military professionalism, which dictated that an outnumbered and hopelessly surrounded enemy should be given the chance to surrender honorably before being annihilated. Leutwitz, steeped in this tradition and confident in his vast superiority in heavy artillery and tanks, decided to offer the Americans a dignified exit. It was an act rooted not in mercy, but in profound arrogance, a condescending gesture extended to a defeated foe who simply hadn't realized their defeat yet. That afternoon, two German emissaries, Major Wagner and Lieutenant Helmuth, bearing a formal typed note, were escorted through the lines toward the American command post. The message they carried was explicit, detailed, and utterly dismissive of American prospects. It was addressed to the American commander of the encircled town. "The fortune of war has changed," the note declared. "There is only one possibility of saving the encircled American troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town." It elaborated on the hopelessness of the situation. All 6 roads leading to Bastogne were controlled by German forces, relief columns were impossible, and the enormous concentration of German artillery could wipe out the entire garrison. The demand was immediate, and the offer was a guaranteed, honorable treatment for all prisoners, including doctors and chaplains. The alternative, the note warned, was the absolute destruction of the American position within 2 hours of the deadline. This highly formal, almost polite demand for capitulation was received by the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe. General Maxwell Taylor, the divisional commander, was absent, stranded outside the salient. McAuliffe, a former artilleryman not known for diplomatic flair, was in the midst of a critical staff meeting when the German document was presented. The American officers read the note in disbelief, then rising indignation. The German tone suggested that American resistance was a naive mistake that needed correcting by superior military minds. This was not the rough, exhausted cynicism of the Eastern Front. This was the haughty declaration of a commander who felt he was dealing with amateurs. A profound silence hung in the room as the officers tried to parse the formal language, the inherent threats, and the sheer audacity of the demand. McAuliffe finally broke the silence, holding the paper up. He was utterly baffled as to how to respond to such a demand. It was completely outside his frame of reference for how one conducted oneself in combat. "Well, what shall I tell them?" he muttered to his staff. Colonel Harry Kennard, the divisional G3 operations officer, reportedly suggested a concise, contemptuous answer. After a moment of thought, McAuliffe settled on his infamous, immortal reply. He scribbled it on a piece of paper, folded it, and handed it to Colonel Joseph Harper, the officer tasked with relaying the answer to the German delegation. Harper hurried back to the outpost where the German negotiators waited. The Germans were expecting a detailed reply, perhaps a counteroffer or a plea for time. Instead, Harper handed them the small slip of paper containing the entire American reply. It was one word: nuts. The German officers were stunned. They did not understand the word. It required repeated attempts at translation. Was it affirmative? Negative? A slang term? Harper, finally losing patience, explained it clearly. It means the same as go to hell. The immediate German reaction was one of injured pride and confused rage. Their offer of honorable terms, exted out of what they perceived as professional courtesy, had been spat upon. Lutwitz received the reply, and the ensuing confusion within the German staff revealed how profoundly disconnected their arrogance was from the reality of the American fighting spirit. The Germans had judged the 101st by their equipment shortages and their encirclement, entirely failing to gauge the corrosive effect the nuts reply would have on their own morale and the galvanizing effect it had on the Americans. The exchange at Bastogne became the defining moral event of the Battle of the Bulge. It was not the arrival of Patton's tanks that broke the German spirit, but the refusal of the encircled paratroopers to play by the rules of inevitability set forth by their German opponent. The German assumption of superiority had led them to believe that logic and circumstance would compel surrender. They failed to account for the stubborn, defiant, often irrational courage that defines a fighting democracy when pushed to the brink. When the relief finally came, it did not find a defeated, starving garrison, but a body of men hardened by cold and defiance, ready to attack outward. The legacy of that single, contemptuous syllable shouted across the frozen lines of the Ardennes transcended military tactics. It signaled to the world that the Wehrmacht's power to intimidate and destroy was gone, replaced by a desperate, arrogant bluff that had been called by a single powerful word of American defiance, cementing the stand at Bastogne as the spiritual turning point in the final dark winter of the European War. December 22nd, 1944, late morning inside the cramped, freezing, and perpetually vibrating command post cellar in Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were surrounded, hammered by artillery, and running desperately short on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe, the acting commander, was attempting to stabilize a line held together mostly by ice and sheer guts when 2 German officers and 2 enlisted men, proceeding under a flag of truce, were brought forward. They carried with them the formal demand that would define the entire siege. The German ultimatum was delivered in meticulously prepared English, reflecting the rigid formality of the Wehrmacht bureaucracy. It began with an assessment of the American position, declaring it hopeless, detailing the overwhelming strength and disposition of the encircling Panzer forces, a statement of facts designed to terrify the recipient into immediate submission. The document offered a humanitarian concession. If the Americans surrendered immediately, they would be treated with honor, and the wounded spared the carnage of continued fighting. The consequence of refusal, the message warned, was the total annihilation of the American garrison. It was signed by Generalleutnant Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz, commanding the XL-Wehr Panzer Corps. McAuliffe, weary from sleepless nights and the constant rumble of distant explosions, was momentarily baffled. He read the note, passed it to his staff officers, and then famously asked, "What in hell do they want?" The concept of a formal Surrender ultimatum was foreign to him, rooted in the old-world customs of warfare between established empires, not the gritty, decentralized fight the Americans were waging. His officers began formulating a long, formal refusal, detailing the American capacity to fight and the absurdity of the German demand a military reply befitting the high-stakes situation. McAuliffe cut them short. His exasperation and fundamental disbelief in the necessity of such diplomatic exchange boiled over. After pacing the cramped room, he reportedly slapped the table and declared that the situation was utterly ridiculous. When pressed by his staff for a concise reply to be delivered back to the waiting German emissaries, he simply uttered the phrase that would instantly become immortal: "Nuts!" The staff immediately recognized the power of that crude, dismissive piece of American slang. Yet they faced a profound logistical and diplomatic problem. How do you formally transmit nuts as an official reply to a detailed military surrender demand? After a quick internal debate that saw more formal phrasing rejected things like "go to hell" or "we refuse," the decision was made to stick to the general's original untranslatable word. Colonel Harry Kennard, one of McAuliffe's key staff officers, penned the official one-sentence response to the German commander. Nuts. The American commander, Colonel Joseph Harper, was tasked with delivering this cryptic communique back to the German party. The Germans were waiting patiently, expecting a detailed letter of negotiation, or at least a solemn, formalized refusal of surrender. When Harper handed the brief note to the senior German officer, the interpreter struggled visibly. He knew the literal meaning of the word. It referred to a specific anatomical part, but he could not place it within the context of military diplomacy. Was it a code word? Was it a formal acceptance or a total rejection? The officer demanded clarification. Harper, maintaining a perfect composure, replied, "It means the same as go to hell, and that's the of it." The Germans were stunned. They requested that the matter be formally put into writing. Harper obliged, writing a note on the back of a message pad confirming the meaning. The German emissaries departed, reportedly confused and deeply insulted by the brevity and contemptuous nature of the response. They were expecting a professional, tactical decision, not a shout of defiance delivered through vulgar American slang. That single word, nuts, was immediately relayed up the German command chain, causing equal consternation at headquarters. The Germans, conditioned by years of meticulous adherence to military procedure, failed completely to grasp the psychological significance of the reply. They interpreted it as crude American arrogance, but fundamentally it signaled something far deeper, an unyielding refusal to acknowledge defeat, not just tactically but spiritually. The word spread like wildfire through the besieged American perimeter. It was morale-boosting genius. The troops, shivering in their foxholes, heard the news. Their commander had not politely declined the offer of surrender. He had spat contempt at it. The absurdity of the reply transformed the desperation of the siege into a dark, unifying joke. The American soldiers knew then that there would be no negotiation, no retreat, only the fight to the finish. For the German forces, who were already fighting a timetable war against the arrival of General Patton's Third Army, McAuliffe's reply was a catastrophic psychological blow. They realized that their carefully calculated threat of annihilation had utterly failed to break the will of the Americans. They had called the enemy's bluff and been mocked for it. They had to continue the relentless, costly, house-to-house, wood-to-wood attack against a force whose spirit had just been galvanized by one dismissive, slang-filled word. The stand at Bastogne, defined by that iconic refusal, became the ultimate manifestation of American defiance during the darkest hours of the European winter. It was a propaganda victory immediately recognized around the globe, symbolizing the raw, unpolished, yet absolutely unbreakable resolve of the American soldier. Long after the tactical details of the Ardennes fighting faded into history, that four-letter word remained eternally etched in the narrative of the war, a monument to the power of pure contempt hurled against overwhelming, arrogant power, signifying that in the final calculation the greatest military machine in Europe had lost its capacity to inspire fear. The wars was still months away, and the fighting would be brutal and costly. Yet Bastogne and its legally impudent reply stood as the undeniable proof that the tide had turned forever, not by overwhelming force, but by an irreducible core of human stubbornness. December 23, 1944, the headquarters of the XLVII Panzer Corps, northwest of Bastogne. The air was thick with the chilling reality that the swift, contemptuous victory Hitler had envisioned was dissolving into a grinding siege. General Heinrich von Leutwitz, having received the infamous reply from the Americans, the single dismissive word, nuts, understood immediately that the psychological battle, perhaps the most critical component of the Ardennes offensive, had been catastrophically lost. The humiliation of the refusal to surrender was surpassed only by the strategic disaster it implied. The green, soft Americans, mocked so thoroughly in the opening days of the assault, had solidified their perimeter and found their voice. The Germans, therefore, abandoned all pretense of a fluid encirclement maneuver. They transitioned from arrogance to deadly, methodical fury. The High Command recognized that their precious timetable, the need to seize the Meuse bridges before the weather broke, depended entirely on crushing Bastogne immediately. The strategic imperative became simple: obliterate the pocket. This meant a shift from probing attacks and containment to massed, overwhelming force designed to physically rupture the American lines. The period beginning December 23rd saw the unleashing of the full force of the German war machine against the beleaguered perimeter. Artillery, held back only slightly during the mobile phase, now began a sustained and terrifying bombardment. Heavy 150mm howitzers, backed by the nerve-shattering whistle of Nebelwerfer rockets, churned the frozen woods and fields surrounding the town. For the diverse composite force of the 101st Airborne Division and tank destroyers and remnants of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command, the noise was constant, the concussion crippling. The only safe space was deep within a foxhole dug into the iron-hard earth, covered with a few logs that offered slight protection against shrapnel, but none against a direct hit. The primary assault vector targeted the villages holding the perimeter's shoulders. The Germans hammered Marvy in the southeast and the crucial transportation hub of Warden, sensing that if they could break the eastern side, they could sever any hope of resupply and flood the main defenses. Simultaneously, devastating armor thrusts hit the northern areas, particularly around Foy and Novel, where the most desperate fighting of the earlier days had taken place. These attacks were no longer cautious. They were tidal waves of steel. On Christmas Eve, the Cresco reached a fever pitch. As the rest of the world contemplated truce, the American defers used the heaviest, most concentrated shelling of the entire campaign. The weather, which had provided the German army cover, finally began to relent, allowing a brief window of air activity, but the ground pressure remained unrelenting. The Panzers, chiefly those of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the Führer Begleit Brigade, coordinated their final all-or-nothing thrusts. The fighting was not just brutal, it was intimate. German infantry, often reduced to grenadiers fighting without adequate armor support due to the narrow roads and clustered defenses, engaged in vicious trench clearing and house-to-house combat in the small villages. American paratroopers suffering severe losses from frostbite, exhaustion, and sustained incoming fire clung to their positions with an almost maniacal tenacity. They understood that retreating even 50 yards meant jeopardizing the entire perimeter. Their discipline was absolute. Their stubbornness was the only supply they did not lack. The critical moment came late on Christmas Day, December 25th. The Germans launched their most formidable attack against Marvy and Assenois on the southern flank. This assault was perfectly timed and powerfully executed, aimed at the hinge where the American defenses were thinnest. German tanks punched through the outer screen. American field artillery batteries, normally reserved for distant targets, lowered their barrels and began firing directly at the approaching tanks at point-blank range, turning the battlefield into a vast, fiery melee. For a few terrifying hours, the perimeter wavered. Reports filtered back to the command post that the line was being, maybe even breaking. If the Germans managed to gain a foothold on the main roads leading into Bastogne itself, the defense would collapse, and the entire momentum of the Ardennes counteroffensive would swing back into Germany's favor. But the defers held. In Marvy, a small group of engineers, armed with little more than desperation and bazookas, stopped two spearhead tank companies cold. What the Germans failed to understand was that the American command structure, stripped of the mobility afforded by high command, had become decentralized and hyper-focused. Every colonel, every captain, every sergeant knew precisely where the line was and knew that their life and the lives of the entire division depended on not yielding a single yard. They fought for the man next to them, for the supplies that were finally starting to reach them via airdrop, and for the simple, defiant promise embedded in the word nuts. The failure of the Christmas Day assault broke the back of the German offensive at Bastogne. It was the moment Hitler's greatest gamble ran out of chips. The German high command had committed their most valuable strategic asset, the last of their armored reserves and highly trained infantry, to crush a single encircled town, and they had failed. They had traded mobility for siege, and in doing so had allowed the Allied strategic forces, spearheaded by Patton's Third Army, to close the Vise. The German fury had been tremendous, a testament to their military prowess, but their inability to exploit the penetrations proved fatal. The intensity of the attacks, meant to terrify and demoralize, only served to harden the American resolve. By the time General Patton's tanks finally broke through to the southern perimeter on December 26th, the siege was officially over. But the intense combat within the perimeter had already ensured its strategic victory. Bastogne was never simply a geographic location. It became a reservoir of German strategic fuel, emptied drop by costly drop. The American stand was not measured in miles gained or lost, but in the irrecoverable loss of German capacity to wage offensive war. The German army spent its future on those frozen foxholes, sacrificing the men and machines needed for the subsequent, desperate defense of the Rhine, all because they could not tolerate the impudence of an encircled foe who refused to yield. The cost of that refusal, paid in blood and frozen suffering, transcended the battle itself, settling permanently the question of who held the initiative and who was merely fighting for survival. It became the definitive, bloody proof that the war's final act had begun, ushered in not by technological superiority, but by the sheer unreasonable will to stand fast against overwhelming final assaults. The failure to take Bastogne meant the failure of the final German offensive on the Western Front, consigning Hitler's last desperate dream to the blood-soaked snow of the Ardennes. December 22nd, 1944, outside the besieged Belgian town of Bastogne, the German commanding general sent his final formal demand for surrender. It was a perfectly articulated piece of military theater, detailing the inescapable destruction facing the surrounded American forces' artillery range, overwhelming infantry, certain annihilation. This communication was sent not just to achieve tactical capitulation, but to underline the psychological superiority the Wehrmacht still believed it held over the inexperienced Americans. They saw compliance as logical, prudent, and expected, confirming their long-held belief that these green adversaries lacked the true historical grit necessary for sustained, hopeless defense. The reply, terse and utterly lacking in diplomatic niceties, came back signed by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. It was a single defiant word that echoed across the frozen foxholes and shattered forests. Nuts. This single syllable instantly transformed the siege from a tactical encirclement into a moral stand. The Germans, utterly baffled by the casual rejection of inevitable defeat, were forced to reorganize their timetable and redouble their commitment. They had not been fighting against a supply depot or an army group. They were fighting against an idea, the unreasonable refusal to quit. It was in the days immediately following this exchange that the true character of the American defense was forged, proving that the mockery leveled at them just weeks prior had been a catastrophic misjudgment of their resilience. The tenacity displayed by the 101st Airborne Division, and critically, the elements of the 10th Armored Division and miscellaneous support units caught in the perimeter, went beyond mere training. It was born of necessity and maintained by a sheer bloody obstinacy. They were surrounded by heavy snow and a crushing cold that became a greater enemy than the enemy itself. Frostbite decimated the ranks, communications were tenuous, and the lack of resupply meant that blood plasma froze, re-ring life-saving medical efforts, often futile. The men holding the perimeter, many of them engineers, signal corps operators, and administrative clerks who had never trained for sustained infantry combat, became frontline fighters. Every piece of equipment, every round of ammunition was fought for, hoarded, and utilized with desperate precision. They scraped ice from frozen vehicles, melted snow for water, and waited in foxholes that offered minimal protection against the relentless shelling that pulverized the town and the surrounding woods. The German commanders, frustrated by the delay, hurled armored assaults against the thinning American lines, hoping to find a brittle breaking point. They sought the predictable panic of the amateur, the quick dissolution they had seen on earlier fronts. What they found instead were small, cohesive units, often cut off and fighting independently, refusing to yield a single crossroads or ridgeline. They learned that the logistical advantages the Americans possessed were secondary to their stubborn refusal to accept the reality of their tactical situation. When the skies finally cleared on December 23rd, allowing for the critical aerial resupply drops, the lifeline was secured, but the fighting intensified. Christmas Day brought not peace, but the heaviest and most concerted German attacks of the entire siege, focusing especially on the village of Foy. The paratroopers, exhausted, hungry, and fighting with dwindling strength, faced the fury of panzer divisions designed to crush resistance, not merely repel it. Yet they held, they absorbed the shock, fired until their barrels glowed, and maintained a ragged, unbreakable ring. The sacrifice yield during those dark days around Bastogne solidified a truth that resonated through the rest of the war. American endurance was not merely derived from material wealth, it was rooted in a profound, if sometimes chaotic, commitment to their immediate mission and to the man next to them. This was the moment the green image shattered completely. The Defiers of Bastogne did not fight with professional detachment. They fought with the furious energy of men fighting for the only piece of ground they were allowed to occupy. The long-awaited sound of Patton's advancing armor, the spearhead of the 4th Armored Division finally breaking through the corridor from the south on December 26th, was not the of the fight, but the necessary validation of the stand. The siege was relieved, but the defense had already accomplished its strategic goal. The clock had been run out, the German offensive momentum fatally broken, and Hitler's final Western gamble consigned to irreversible defeat. Bastogne became more than a defensive victory. It was a psychological inflection point. It disabused the Wehrmacht of their final illusions about American softness and proved to the Allied command that the quality of their troops, even when isolated and under immense pressure, was equal to the historical demands of war. The ground won was meager, but the moral victory was total. The price paid in frozen limbs and spilled blood ensured that the path forward, though difficult, would be inexorably toward Berlin. The tenacity born in the frozen woods of the Ardennes defined the character of the final decisive battles, marking the transition from survival to final relentless pursuit. Bastogne stands eternally as the silent, snow-covered testament to the fact that determination, sometimes expressed in the crudest, most defiant terms, can ultimately override even the most overwhelming logistical odds. December 26, 1944, 4:45 p.m. Near the village of Ardennes, Belgium, the defers of Bastogne, huddled in trenches carved from frozen earth, could feel the low, rhythmic concussion of distant, heavy guns growing steadily louder from the south. The sound was not the familiar, terrifying approach of German artillery, but the deep, insistent drumming of American armor, promising either salvation or a final, devastating battle. For 8 days, they had existed in a surreal, suffocating bubble, fighting not just the enemy, but the crushing cold and the slow depletion of every necessary resource. Medical supplies were exhausted, plasma had long run out, ammunition was inventoried round by round. Many of the wounded lay unted, wrapped in blankets stained crimson against the blinding white snow. The relief force was the spearhead of General George S. Patton's 3rd Army, specifically Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division. These were not fresh troops. They were men who had been pulled from fighting in the Saar, executed an almost impossible 90-degree turn, and driven relentlessly north through treacherous conditions. The speed of their deployment was a logistical miracle Patton had promised, and he had delivered, grinding his own men and machines to the breaking point to save the encircled paratroopers. The decisive action centered on the thin line of German resistance stretching between Martelange and Ardennes. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, pushed the limit, his tank commanders straining their eyes through the gloom of the short winter day, searching for the unmistakable outline of American soldiers. Near Ardennes, they met desperate German resistance pillboxes, anti-tank guns hidden in the tree lines, and fanatical infantry determined to keep the door sealed. The breakthrough, when it came, was sudden and dramatic. After heavy fighting that shredded the surrounding woods, 4 Sherman tanks of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Clifford G. Brannan, finally breached the final German line. As the tanks rumbled into the clearing, their crews looked out and saw, not the exhausted faces of trapped men, but a scattering of engineers and forward observers, a vanguard of the 101st Airborne. The link-up was not a formal military ceremony, but a simple, necessary relief, often marked by a wave, a shared cigarette, or a shouted question about the German positions immediately ahead. The sight of the first tank treads cutting through the Bastogne snow was an electrifying jolt of morale, reviving men who had been reduced to shivering automatons. But relief did not mean safety. The corridor opened by the 4th Armored was a needle thread initially less than 300 yards wide, and German forces immediately began maneuvering to pinch it shut again. The fighting throughout the night of the 26th and 27th was less about expanding the perimeter and more about holding this fragile lifeline open. The immediate priority was not infantry support, but logistics. Trucks, hundreds of them, began pouring through the narrow gap, burdened with the cargo most needed: medical supplies, morphine, and high-explosive shells for the decimated artillery batteries. The scenes inside Bastogne were horrifying. Doctors, many operating without anesthesia for days, could finally perform crucial surgeries. The first loads moving south were the thousands of wounded men, now finally safe from capture, their survival secured by the tenacity of the paratroopers and the blinding speed of Patton's advance. The cost of the stand was now becoming clear. Bastogne was a ruined husk, the town center obliterated by days of sustained shelling. The 101st Airborne, though saved, had taken staggering casualties, suffering over 3,000 wounded and more than 500 killed during the siege alone. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and battered, but they were victorious. General McAuliffe, the man who had defined the stand with the single word "nuts," refused the offer to withdraw his battered division for rest. He argued that the men who had held the line were the best suited to lead the counteroffensive. The paratroopers, now resupplied and supported by the fresh momentum of the 3rd Army, were ready to fight their way out. The relief of Bastogne marked the high-water mark for the entire German offensive in the west. From December 27th onward, the initiative belonged irrevocably to the Allies. The Germans were left clinging to a deep salient, exposed on three sides, their fuel reserves dangerously low, and their hopes dashed by the failure to capture the key crossroads. Patton's forces, now joined by the northern thrusts of the First Army, began the relentless work of reducing the Bulge, squeezing the German divisions into a concentrated area where Allied air superiority, once the weather cleared, could devastate them. The final push to clear the Ardennes lasted until the middle of January 1945, characterized by savage, close-quarters combat in the dense forests of the Schnee-Eifel. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately became the largest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II, defining the American commitment through grit and sheer industrial power. Bastogne's silent testimony is complex. It is a monument to tactical brilliance in the face of surprise, certainly, but more profoundly, it solidified the perception that Allied willpower, once set, was unbreakable. The young, green troops that the Germans had mocked months earlier had become the iron core of the fighting force, capable of withstanding encirclement and siege, refusing to yield ground even when faced with annihilation. The stand at Bastogne was the crucible where survival became dominance, shifting the narrative from whether the Allies could hold the line to simply how swiftly they could complete the final campaign. It was the ultimate defiance delivered in the bitter cold, ensuring that the road ahead, though still paved in blood and ice, led directly and inexorably to the final, necessary victory. The sacrifice of those who froze and fought in the encircled perimeter ensured that Hitler's last gamble would only hasten the coming dawn of Allied triumph. January 29th, 1945, 2 p.m. At Bastogne, the initial cheers for the breaking of the siege had long faded, replaced by the grim reality of consolidating the gains and counting the terrible cost. The cost of that triumph, however, was measured not merely in strategic ground held, but in frozen limbs and shattered nerves. American casualties during the Battle of the Bulge totaled nearly 77,000, a devastating toll, but the stand at Bastogne cemented a far more crucial victory: the psychological defeat of the German High Command. They realized that even when faced with numerical superiority, crippling weather, and critical supply shortages, the Allies would not buckle. The audacious gamble that was the Ardennes offensive was broken against the stubborn, icy shield formed by those relatively green troops who had learned the bloody lessons of war in mere days. Bastogne transitioned from a small Belgian crossroads into a permanent monument to American resilience. The 101st Airborne, initially a relatively new experimental division, earned immortality there. Their defense, famously summed up by General McAuliffe's single defiant word, "nuts," became the battle cry for the spirit of unbreakable American resolve that defined the latter half of the war. It was here, surrounded and isolated, that the young republic truly proved its military maturity, demonstrating that its soldiers possessed a fighting heart capable of matching and ultimately overcoming the decades of professional military tradition held by their German adversaries. What remains today is not just the memory of the relief columns finally piercing the perimeter wire, nor the celebratory ragged cheers, but the solemn recognition of the profound historical weight of those few weeks. Bastogne served as the hinge point. It did not the war, but it drained the last vital fighting energy from the Wehrmacht on the Western Front, guaranteeing that the path to the Rhine and ultimately to Berlin would be unobstructed by any further significant offensive resistance. The legacy of Bastogne echoes far beyond the maps and the military textbooks. It speaks to the universal human capacity for durance under the most punishing duress, a testament to ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were the men who, shivering in foxholes, redefined what it meant to stand firm. As the snow melts each spring over the fields they defend, the historical silence settles, reminding us that every decision to hold the line, every frozen trigger finger, and every whispered prayer for survival contributed to the shaping of the world we inhabit now. We look back at Bastogne and see not just a turning point in a battle, but a beacon of courage, reminding us that even in the darkest, most desolate winter, resolve can ignite the fire of inevitable victory. The weight of that sacrifice, etched forever into the icy earth, demands that we never forget the cost of that necessary, hard-won defiance.